The sun beat down on the town of Redemption, baking the dust into a fine red powder that coated every surface and stung the eyes. The air hung thick with the smell of horse sweat, cheap whiskey, and simmering violence. From the shade of the livery stable, Silas McGrow watched the First Territorial Bank. He was a man built for mountains, not for the cramped, sun-blasted confines of a town. At 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like an ox yoke and hair that hung past his collar in a dark, silver-streaked cascade, he moved with the unsettling stillness of a predator. The bone-handled knife at his belt was a legacy carved by his father, with the story of their family's connection to the wildlands. His Colt Peacemaker holstered low on his hip was a tool no different from an axe or skinning knife, and he was a master of its use. He had been in Redemption for 2 days, a place whose name felt like a cruel joke. There was no redemption here, only dust and desperation. He was tracking a storm, a human one named Jake Morrison. For months, Morrison's gang had cut a bloody swath across the territory, but their recent robberies had been different. They were too clean, too precise, and they followed a pattern that led Silas to believe Morrison was after more than just gold. He was hunting something or someone. A flicker of movement across the street drew his eye. A woman guided a small boy out of the general store, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. The boy clutched a porcelain doll, its painted face a perfect mask of serene innocence. For a heartbeat, the dusty street faded, replaced by the ghost of another time. Green grass, the scent of pine, and the sound of a child's laughter. His child. Emma. The memory was a knife twist in his gut, sharp and deep. He forced it down, focusing back on the bank. That was when the storm broke. It began not with thunder, but with the brutal efficiency of a wolf pack. 4 riders materialized at the end of the street, their horses moving at a controlled canter that was more menacing than an all-out gallop. At their head was a man whose calm demeanor was a chilling counterpoint to the violence he commanded. Jake Morrison was handsome in a severe way, with intelligent eyes and a mouth that seemed perpetually on the verge of a sneer. He dismounted with an unhurried grace, 2 of his men following him toward the bank, while the 3rd remained on his horse, a rifle held ready across his lap. Silas's hand moved instinctively toward his Colt, but he held back. This wasn't his fight. Not yet. His job was to observe, to learn Morrison's methods, to understand the man behind the myth. The bank doors burst open. A woman screamed. Then came the first shot, a deafening crack that sent panicked townsfolk scattering for cover. Dust and gunpowder choked the air. A second shot followed, and then the sickening shatter of glass. Silas's head whipped toward the general store. The woman and her son were frozen on the boardwalk, paralyzed by terror. The stray bullet had ripped through the store's front window, a spiderweb of cracks erupting from the point of impact. The porcelain doll dropped and the boy's shock lay on the wooden planks. As Silas watched, a shard of falling glass sliced through the air and struck the doll's head, shattering the delicate porcelain face. The world dissolved. The scent of smoke was thick, acrid. Sarah was screaming his name, a sound of pure terror that was being swallowed by the war cries of the Cheyenne. He was fighting his knife, a blur of silver, but there were too many. A warrior's club caught him on the side of the head, and the world spun into a dizzying kaleidoscope of pain and fire. He saw Sarah, her dark hair wild, trying to push their daughter, little 5-year-old Emma, behind the towering pines at the edge of their homestead. "Run, Emma, get behind the trees," he roared, his voice raw. Emma, clutching a corn-husk doll she'd made for the baby brother who would never be born, looked back at him, her eyes wide with a fear no child should ever know. That was the last thing he saw before the world went black. The image of his daughter's terrified face, the shattered husk of her little doll lying in the dirt beside her fallen mother. The sound of another gunshot jerked Silas back to the present. The boy in redemption was wailing, his mother pulling him into the relative safety of the store's doorway. The shattered doll lay on the boardwalk, a grim echo of a memory he could never escape. The cold fury that Silas had spent 5 years trying to bury erupted like a geyser. This was his fight now. Morrison had made it so. He drew his Colt, the motion a blur of practiced fury. He didn't aim for Morrison, not yet. He aimed for the man on horseback, the lookout. The rifleman was raising his weapon, preparing to fire into the panicked street. Silas's shot was perfect. The bullet struck the man's rifle, splintering the stock and sending a shock of pain up his arm that made him drop the weapon with a curse. Morrison and his men burst from the bank canvas sacks slung over their shoulders. Morrison's eyes, cold and sharp, scanned the street and locked onto Silas. There was no surprise in his gaze, only a flicker of something that looked unnervingly like recognition. Almost like he had been expecting him. Well, Morrison's voice was deceptively calm, carrying easily over the chaos. Look what the mountain dragged in. The great Silas McGraw. Glass shattered. Another woman screamed. Morrison's men opened fire, not at Silas, but into the air, into the storefronts, creating a wall of terror to cover their escape. Silas fired back not to kill, but to cripple. A bullet took one man's horse in the foreleg, sending it and its rider crashing to the ground. Another shot tore through the saddlebag of a second rider, sending a cascade of gold coins spinning across the dusty street. Through the smoke and confusion, Morrison swung onto his horse, his eyes never leaving Silas's. He gave a small mocking salute before spurring his mount into a gallop, his men close behind. Silas fired once more, the bullet whizzing past Morrison's ear, a promise of what was to come. He was a fool. He'd let his rage take over, revealed himself before he understood his enemy. Wounded and outmatched, he melted back into the shadows of the alleyways, the pursuit already beginning. Morrison's men were professionals. They wouldn't just run. They would circle back. They would hunt. Bleeding from a ricochet that had torn a furrow across his ribs, Silas pushed himself west toward the jagged peaks that were his only true home. He ran for 3 miles, a running gun battle through dense forest, using every trick he'd ever learned to stay ahead of the outlaws. He lost them in the high passes, as a sudden blizzard descended a white curtain that gave him the cover he needed. But the cold, the blood loss, and the bone-deep exhaustion were finally taking their toll. His vision began to tunnel the snow-covered ground, seeming to rush up to meet him. He stumbled upon a small, isolated cabin, a wisp of smoke curling from its chimney, a beacon of life in a world of white death. The last thing he remembered was pushing open a barn door and the smell of hay and warm animals, a strange comfort as he collapsed, his world finally going dark. Clara Ara Whitmore had spent 3 years learning the language of silence. She knew the whisper of wind through the pines, the sharp crack of a frozen branch, the soft sigh of snow settling on her roof. But the heavy thud she heard from the barn was a foreign sound, a violent intrusion into her carefully ordered world. She had come to this cabin on a ledge carved into the mountainside to escape a different kind of noise, the pitying whispers of St. Louis society, after her husband Thomas had died, leaving her a childless widow, drowning in debt and grief. The first winter had nearly broken her. The cold was a physical entity that bit through every chink in the logs. But in that struggle, Clara Ara had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. Her hands, once soft and suited for embroidery, became calloused and capable. She learned to split wood until her shoulders ached, to read the coming weather in the clouds, to make the cabin not just a shelter, but a home. By the 3rd year, her life had settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the simple, brutal necessities of survival. But this sound, a grown, half-human, half-animal, was not part of that rhythm. Wrapping a shawl over her head, she fought her way through the swirling snow to the barn. The heavy crossbar on the door was dislodged. Inside her, 2 horses shifted nervously, their eyes wide. Then she saw him. He was a giant of a man sprawled in the hay, like a fallen oak, a pool of blood, melting the snow around him. His buckskin shirt was torn and soaked a dark, ugly crimson. A crumpled wanted poster lay partially trapped beneath his body, the name Silas McGraw, and the word murder stark against the paper. Fear cold and sharp seized her. Every story she'd ever heard about the mountain man they called Grizzly painted him as a savage. Harboring a wanted killer could bring the law, or worse, the man's enemies to her door. Her first instinct was to run to bar the cabin door and pretend she'd seen nothing. But as she knelt beside him, her fear gave way to a deeper instinct, one nurtured by years of faith and loss. Her worn leather prayer book, carried by her mother from Ireland, was filled with stories of mercy. This was what faith meant in practice, not just Sunday prayers, but the daily choice to serve something larger than self-interest. His skin burned with fever. She counted 3 bullet wounds, one in his shoulder, another in his side, and a third that had grazed his scalp. Whatever sins this man had committed, he was dying. And she was the only one who could help. The decision made itself. For 3 weeks, Clara Ara lived in a suspended reality, her world shrinking to the space around the makeshift bed she'd made for him near her fireplace. She cleaned his wounds with her precious whiskey, stitched his torn flesh with a sewing needle, and spooned broth between his fever-cracked lips. She prayed over his unconscious form, reading aloud from the Book of Ruth, while his breathing was so shallow she feared each breath would be his last. In his delirium, he spoke fragments of words, warnings, and names. "Sarah," he called out once, his voice full of desperate urgency. "Get behind the trees." Slowly, her care began to work. The angry red of infection faded. Color returned to his face. She found herself studying him, memorizing the strong line of his jaw beneath the dark beard, the surprising length of his lashes against his high cheekbones. He was handsome in a raw, untamed way that was entirely foreign to her. Thomas had been a gentleman, soft-spoken and civilized. This stranger was something else entirely, something primal and dangerous. On the 21st day, she was reading aloud when she felt a change in the room, a shift in the quality of his stillness. She looked up from the page. His eyes, a clear, intelligent gray, were open and fixed on her. They studied each other in a silence that felt more profound than any she had ever known. She saw him cataloging every detail of her face, the room, his situation. It should have been unnerving, but she felt a strange sense of calm, as if she had passed some unspoken test. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rasp, rough from disuse, but carrying an unnerving weight of absolute conviction. "I'll make you a mother before spring." The words struck her like a physical blow. Heat flooded her cheeks, and her heart hammered against her ribs. It was an outrageous, presumptuous, and utterly improper declaration. Yet she found herself frozen, unable to protest. There was no mockery in his expression, no casual lust. There was only a raw, genuine intention backed by a will that seemed to have been forged in the very heart of the mountains. It was not a boast. It was a promise delivered with the gravity of a man who had looked death in the face and had decided unequivocally what he wanted from life. Clara Ara's face burned. She stood abruptly, nearly dropping her prayer book, and busied herself stoking the fire, anything to avoid his intense gaze. The silence in the small cabin felt heavy enough to suffocate. "You need broth." She finally managed her voice a pitch higher than usual. "You've been delirious." Silas watched her move, his gray eyes tracking her with an unnerving focus. When he spoke again, his tone was softer. "Didn't mean to shock you, ma'am. Sometimes a man says what's in his heart before he finds the proper words." She paused, surprised by his attempt at an apology. She'd braced herself for crude insistence, not this careful deference. When she finally met his eyes again, she saw the bone-deep weariness beneath the conviction. "I am Clara Ara Whitmore," she said, offering the simple dignity of a name. "Silas McGraw." He winced as he tried to shift against the pillows. Though I suspect you already know that. His gaze flickered to the wanted poster she'd tucked away on a high shelf. Found that, did you? Wondered if you might. He paused, probably wondering if you're safe with a wanted man in your house. The question was honest and necessary. The poster says murder, she stated carefully. Says a lot of things, Silas countered, his eyes holding hers. Question is whether you believe everything you read, or whether you judge a man by what you see for yourself. Clara Ara ladled broth into a cup. She had seen him helpless, fevered, calling out a warning to protect someone named Sarah. She had seen the raw will to live that had pulled him back from the brink. These were not the actions of a cold-blooded monster. I see a man who was shot 3 times and left for dead, she said, bringing him the cup. I see a man who fought hard to live. And you see a fool who makes promises he has no right making. He accepted the cup, his large hands dwarfing the delicate china. But I meant what I said, Clara Ara Whitmore. I don't rightly know why yet, but I meant it. The way he spoke her full name sent an unexpected shiver through her. Thomas had called her Clara Bird, making her name light and airy. Silas spoke it as if it were something solid and precious, each syllable given its proper weight. Over the next few days, a careful truce settled between them. Clara Ara tended his wounds, maintaining a professional distance. Silas accepted her care with a quiet gratitude that never felt presumptuous, but his eyes followed her everywhere. As he regained his strength, he grew restless. She found him one morning, attempting to split kindling his movements, careful but determined. You'll tear your stitches, she chided, taking the axe from him. A man can't lay in bed like an invalid while a woman does all the work, he replied, his jaw set. Besides, I heal better when I'm moving. At least let me check your bandages first. Inside, as she unwrapped the dressing on his ribs, he spoke quietly. You have gentle hands. Firm when they need to be, but gentle. She tried to ignore the way his voice made her pulse quicken. Living alone means being your own doctor. It's more than that. His gaze was intent. There's something in you that wants to heal things. You probably can't help yourself. His observation was uncomfortably accurate. Maybe that's why God led me to your barn, she said without thinking. Then blushed at the admission. You think God had a hand in this? His tone was curious, not mocking. I think God works through ordinary people doing ordinary kindness. She secured the new bandage. Plenty of people would have left me to die, Silas said, his hand suddenly closing gently around hers. Or turned me in for that reward money. $500 could change your life. Blood money never brought anyone happiness, she said firmly, her skin tingling where he touched her. Is your life the way you want it? His thumb traced a line across her knuckles. Or do you just tell yourself that because wanting more seems too dangerous? The question struck a nerve. She pulled her hand away. I should start breakfast. But Silas persisted, his voice gentle but relentless. I've been watching you, Clara Ara. You move through this place like you're trying not to take up too much space, like you're apologizing for being alive. He gestured around the Spartan cabin. There are no pictures on these walls. No personal touches beyond what's necessary. You're not living. You're surviving. His words stung because they were true. She had stripped her life down to its barest essentials, telling herself it was practical. But he saw the fear beneath the practicality. Maybe I learned not to get too attached to things that can be taken away, she whispered. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Someone hurt you badly. Life hurt me, she corrected, turning to the stove. I'm not the first woman to lose a husband, but you decided it was safer to stop living than risk loving again. The accusation, so devastatingly accurate, made her hands still. And in that moment, she understood that this man saw not just the capable widow, but the frightened woman hiding inside. That night, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing from the bed near the fire, she thought of his promise. I'll make you a mother before spring. It was outrageous, impossible. Yet something deep inside her, a part she thought had died, with Thomas stirred in response. She placed a hand over her flat stomach, a gesture of old, forgotten hope. The doctors in St. Louis had been so certain, so dismissive. But what if they had been wrong? What if this strange, dangerous man could give her the one thing her gentle husband never could? The thought was scandalous, yet it refused to leave her as she lay in the quiet darkness, listening to the sound of another human heartbeat in her lonely home. As Silas's body healed, he began to subtly reshape the world inside the cabin. He carved a small, perfect wildflower from a scrap of pine and left it on her table. He fixed the squeaky hinge on her door that she had long since stopped noticing. He started cooking their meals, transforming simple venison and wild onions into something that tasted of care and intention. 30 years of feeding myself, he explained when she asked where he'd learned. A man gets tired of charred meat. Good food is one of life's reliable pleasures. A shame to waste it. After one such meal, he presented her with a hand-carved spoon, its surface smooth as silk, its handle decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to tell a story. For you, he said simply. Clara Ara held it, marveling at the hours of work it represented. It was more than a utensil. It was a declaration that she deserved beauty in her life. It's too fine for everyday use, she protested. No such thing, Silas said firmly. You're worth fine things every day. That night, she held the spoon as she lay in bed. No one had made something specifically for her in years. The simple gift felt more profound than any jewel. It was a testament to his observant nature, a quiet argument against the stark survival she had embraced. He wasn't just occupying her space. He was enriching it. With the first signs of spring, a new tension entered the cabin. Silas began spending hours at the window, his gaze scanning the landscape, his hand often straying to his hip, where his Colt usually rested. Winter kept us safe, he said one morning, his voice grim. Spring makes travel possible again, for men who might still be looking for me. He turned from the window. I should leave. Every day I stay here puts you in more danger, and every day you leave too soon puts your life at risk. She countered, her voice sharper than she intended. You're not fully healed. Weak enough to get you killed if they find me here, he said, his jaw set. Better I take my chances on the trail. Clara Ara turned away, busying herself at the hearth to hide the sudden sharp pain his words caused. She had allowed herself to think of him as a fixture, a part of her life. The realization of how much she had come to care for him was a shock. Maybe you're right, she said, her voice carefully neutral. He crossed the room to stand behind her. Clara Ara, look at me. When she finally turned, he saw the truth in her eyes. You don't want me to go. What I want isn't relevant, she insisted. What's practical, what's safe, is it? He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of pine and leather that clung to him. Or are you just afraid to admit you care what happens to me? Of course I care. The words burst out of her. I've spent weeks keeping you alive. I've used my supplies, risked my reputation. Of course I care. That's not what I meant, and you know it. The intensity in his gaze stripped away her defenses. The truth was a torrent she could no longer hold back. I'm terrified, she whispered. Terrified of caring about someone again. Terrified of losing someone again. Terrified of wanting things I can't have. What things? The things you promised me, she said, her voice barely audible. Family. A future. A purpose beyond mere survival. He reached up and cupped her face in his large, warm hands. Those aren't things you can't have, Clara Ara. They're things you've been afraid to reach for. And what if I reach and lose everything again? What if you don't reach and lose it all anyway? His voice was soft, relentless. You're already living like you've lost everything that matters. At least wanting something gives you a chance of getting it. Before she could form a reply, he leaned down and kissed her. It was not like the gentle, chaste kisses Thomas had given her. This was raw and honest, a kiss of profound hunger and deep tenderness, a silent confirmation of everything that had grown between them in the quiet cabin. Her body, starved for touch, responded with a desperation that shocked her. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "This is madness," she whispered. Maybe Silas agreed, his forehead resting against hers. "But it's honest madness. Better than pretending we don't feel what we feel." That evening, the space between them by the fire had changed. It was charged with acknowledged desire. "Tell me about Sarah." Clara Ara said quietly, needing to understand the ghost that lived in his past. His hand stilled on the piece of wood he was carving. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "Sarah was my wife. Died in a Cheyenne raid 5 years ago. We lost our unborn child with her. A boy." The pieces clicked into place, his promise, his loneliness, the fierce protective energy that radiated from him. "Is that why you made that promise to me? Because of what you lost?" "I made that promise because of what I found," he said, his gaze direct and unwavering. "You saved my life, Clara Ara. More than that, you reminded me what a life is worth living for." Later, lying awake in her narrow bed, Clara Ara thought about courage. Not the courage to survive a blizzard, but the courage to open a frozen heart. She had been so afraid of losing again that she had forgotten how to live. Silas, a man who had lost everything, was teaching her that the only true loss was in never risking love at all. In the quiet darkness, she made a decision. When Silas woke the next morning, he found her sitting by the fire, mending one of his torn shirts. "You're thinking about him," he said, nodding toward the faded shirt that had belonged to Thomas. She didn't deny it. At his gentle prompting, she told him about Thomas, about their quiet life, and about the deep, abiding grief of their childlessness. "The doctors, they said the problem was with me." She confessed, the old shame coloring her cheeks. "I need you to know that, Silas, before you make any more promises." Instead of the disappointment she expected, she saw only tenderness in his eyes. "Did those doctors ever run their tests on your husband?" he asked gently. "No. In those days they just assumed. They assumed the woman was the problem." He finished, shaking his head. "Doctors don't know everything, Clara Ara. What if they were wrong? But what if they were right? What if I can't give you children?" He lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Then we'll love the children God sends our way. There are orphans who need a family, children from broken homes." He hesitated, his expression clouding over. Maybe my own daughter, if I can ever find her again." The words hung in the air. Your daughter, Clara Ara's heart seized. He looked away, and she knew he had revealed more than he'd intended. "Had a daughter," he corrected quietly. "Her name is Emma. She'd be 12 now. Her grandmother, Sarah's mother. She took Emma east after the funeral. Blamed me for Sarah's death. Said a man like me was too dangerous to raise a child. Was she right?" The question was blunt but necessary. Maybe, Silas admitted with a devastating honesty that tore at her heart. "My life has been a violent one. But I loved that little girl more than my own breath. I would have done anything to keep her safe." Clara Ara saw the raw grief in his face, the agony of a father torn from his child. This wasn't a rival for his affection. This was a gaping wound in his soul. "Maybe someday we can find her," she said softly. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of genuine hope in his eyes. "I meant what I said," she affirmed, taking his hand. "I trust you. That includes trusting your love for your daughter." That night, when Clara Ara invited Silas to share her bed, it was with the full knowledge of the complexities that lay ahead. They were two wounded souls, carrying ghosts from the past and uncertainties about the future. But as he held her in the darkness, his large hands mapping her body, with a reverence that made her feel cherished, she knew that love did not require perfection. It only required the courage to build something new from the broken pieces of the past. Weeks later, while mending his blood-stained buckskin coat, her fingers found a folded piece of paper tucked into a hidden inner pocket. It was a letter dated 3 months prior. Her first instinct was to respect his privacy, but the paper felt important, freighted with the secrets he still held. She unfolded it. The elegant feminine handwriting was cold and formal. Mr. Monroe, I am writing to inform you of developments regarding your daughter, Emma Rose. As you know, I have opposed any contact believing your lifestyle too dangerous for a child. However, Emma has grown increasingly defiant. She speaks constantly of finding you and has attempted to run away twice. The child seems to have inherited your stubborn disposition. Grove, I am therefore prepared to reconsider our arrangement. If you can demonstrate that you have abandoned your dangerous pursuits and established a respectable household, I might be persuaded to allow the supervised visits. The letter was signed, Mrs. Catherine Donovan, with an address in Denver. At the bottom, a child's careful script added a heartbreaking plea. Papa, I miss you. Please come find me. Love, Emma. Clara Ara's hands trembled. He had been carrying this sliver of hope for 3 months and had said nothing. When Silas entered the cabin, he saw the letter in her hand and the look on her face. You read it, he said, his voice flat with weary resignation. You have a daughter who is waiting for you, and you didn't tell me her hurt was a sharp edge in her voice. I didn't know how, he admitted, sinking heavily into a chair. That letter arrived the day before I tracked the Morrison gang to redemption. I've been carrying it ever since, trying to figure out what to do. What is there to decide? She's your daughter. She wants the father she remembers, not the man I've become. His voice was raw with a pain he could no longer hide. After Sarah died, I spent 5 years hunting down every man in that war party. I made them pay. The man who did that, he isn't fit to be a father. That wanted poster Clara, that's not for some outlaw brawl. It's for what I did to those men. She finally understood the true depth of his guilt. So you think you'll get Emma killed too? Just like Sarah. Men like me don't get to have families, he whispered. We're marked by violence. Emma is safer with her grandmother, learning to be a lady. And what about me? Clara Ara's voice was quiet, but steady. Am I better off without you too? The pain in his eyes was her answer. You're different. You're strong. You chose this. Emma is just a child. Emma is a child who needs her father, Clara Ara insisted, holding the letter out to him. Maybe the question isn't whether you're good enough for her. Maybe it's whether you love her enough to try to be. He stared at the letter, his fear a palpable thing in the small room. What if I fail her again? What if you don't try and you regret it for the rest of your life? She countered. Love without risk isn't love, Silas. It's just fear wearing a mask. He finally took the letter from her hand, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the decision. He was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. If I go to Denver, I want you to come with me. Clara Ara's heart stopped. If I'm going to be the father Emma deserves, he continued, his gray eyes locking with hers, I need to do it with the woman who taught me how to be a man again. That promise I made you, about being a mother. Maybe it was always meant to include Emma too. The possibility hung between them, as terrifying as it was beautiful. She thought of the 12-year-old girl waiting for a father who thought himself unworthy. She thought of herself who had been afraid to want a family. And she thought of him, the man, who had stumbled into her life and taught her how to be brave. When do we leave for Denver? She asked. Their arrival in Denver was a jarring collision with a world they had both left behind. The city was a chaotic symphony of noise and motion, the clang of trolley bells, the rumble of freight wagons, the cacophony of 1,000 conversations. They took a room in a modest boarding house, and Silas spent 2 days gathering information. He moved through the city's underbelly like a ghost, listening in saloons and stables, piecing together whispers about Jake Morrison. What he learned was unsettling. Morrison wasn't just a bank robber. He was disciplined, strategic, and his men spoke of him with a fear that bordered on reverence. More disturbing, Silas heard his own name mentioned. Morrison had been asking questions not about a rival outlaw, but personal questions about his past, about his wife. On the third day, they stood across the street from a pristine two-story house with a white picket fence, the address from the letter. It looked like a dollhouse, a perfect, fragile thing that had no place in the world, Silas knew. "She's in there," he said, his voice tight. "What if she hates me?" Clara Ara took his hand. "She wrote that note, Silas. She loves you." A formidable-looking woman with steel-gray hair answered their knock. Her eyes, the same piercing gray as Sarah's, narrowed as she took in Silas's size and rugged appearance. "May I help you?" she asked, her voice laced with ice. Mrs. Donovan Silas said, his own voice strained. "I'm Silas McGraw. I've come for my daughter." The woman's face hardened into a mask of contempt. "You have no daughter here. You forfeited that right the day you led my Sarah to her death." "That's not for you to decide," Silas growled, his control slipping. "It is precisely for me to decide," she retorted. "I will not allow that child to be corrupted by a violent, lawless man. She is safe here. She is learning to be a lady. You will not interfere." "Papa," a small voice came from behind Mrs. Donovan. A girl with wide, dark eyes and a stubborn chin peered around the older woman's frame. It was Emma. She had Sarah's eyes, but the fierce determination in them was all Silas. The sight of her stole the air from his lungs. "Emma," he breathed. Her face broke into a radiant smile. "You came. I knew you would." She tried to push past her grandmother, but Mrs. Donovan blocked her path. "Go to your room, Emma," she commanded. "No, he's my papa. He is a wanted man who will bring you nothing but ruin." The argument escalated, their voices sharp with years of pain and resentment. It was then that a carriage pulled up to the curb. 4 men disembarked, moving with a purpose that made the hairs on Silas's neck stand up. He recognized them instantly. They were Morrison's men. Clara Ara, get Emma, Silas, shoved them both toward the back of the house as the men advanced up the walkway. "What is the meaning of this?" Mrs. Donovan demanded. But her protest was cut short as one of the men roughly pushed her aside. From the end of the street, Jake Morrison watched from his horse, a satisfied smile on his face. This was never about a bank. It was never about gold. It was a trap, and Silas had walked right into it. The fight was brutal and short. Silas fought like a cornered grizzly, but he was trying to protect Clara Ara and Emma, fighting his way toward the back alley, not just to win. In the chaos, one of Morrison's men grabbed Emma. "Papa," she screamed. Silas turned, and that moment of distraction was all they needed. A pistol butt crashed against the side of his head, and the world exploded in a shower of stars. He felt his last conscious thought, a desperate cry of his daughter's name. When he awoke, the street was quiet. Mrs. Donovan was weeping on her porch, and Clara Ara was kneeling beside him, her face pale with terror. Emma was gone. A small, tarnished silver locket lay on the ground where she had been standing. Silas picked it up. Inside was a faded picture of a young woman with familiar gray eyes. It was Sarah. And standing beside her, his arm around her protectively, was a much younger, smiling Jake Morrison. The truth hit Silas with the force of a physical blow. "He's her brother," he choked out. "Jake is Sarah's brother." Clara Ara stared at him, her eyes wide with horrified understanding. "He blames you." "He blames me for her death," Silas confirmed, his voice a raw whisper of fury and grief. "And now he has my daughter." They tracked them into the mountains, a desperate race against an approaching storm, and a man consumed by a 15-year-old vendetta. Silas was a changed man. The quiet, grieving father was gone, replaced by the relentless hunter he had once been. But now he wasn't hunting for revenge. He was hunting for his child. Clara Ara rode beside him, no longer a frightened widow, but a woman of grim resolve. She had fought for this family, and she would not lose it now. The trail led them high into the peaks, to the skeletal remains of the Blackheart silver mine. A thunderstorm was gathering the sky, a bruised purple, and the wind howled through the timber structures like a mournful ghost. Lightning flashed, illuminating the entrance to the mine shaft. "He's in there," Silas said, his voice flat and cold. "He's waiting for us." Inside, the air was cold and damp, smelling of wet rock and decay. Lanterns cast long, dancing shadows. Emma was tied to a support beam deep within a cavern. Morrison, standing beside her, a pistol held casually in his hand. "Welcome, brother-in-law Morrison," said his voice echoing in the vast space. "So glad you could make it." "Let her go, Jake," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "Oh, I will. After you and I have had a little chat about family." Morrison's calm was more terrifying than any rage. "You see, you took something from me, Silas. You took my sister. You dragged her out to this godforsaken wilderness, filled her head with your nonsense about freedom, and you got her killed. That was a Cheyenne raid," Silas bit out. "You know that. A raid that never would have happened if she'd stayed in St. Louis where she belonged." Morrison's voice cracked the first chink in his armor of control. "I begged her not to go with you. I told her you were nothing but a savage. But she was blinded by you. And you were too proud to see the danger you put her in." As he spoke, another flash of lightning lit the cavern, and Clara Ara saw it a secondary tunnel leading around and behind Morrison's position. She met Silas's eyes, and a silent plan passed between them. "You're right," Silas said, his voice heavy with a guilt he had carried for years. "I should have protected her better. I live with that every day." Morrison laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "You get to live." "She doesn't. That hardly seems fair, does it?" He raised his pistol. "So now you get to feel what it's like to lose a daughter." As Morrison aimed, Silas dove for cover. Simultaneously, Clara Ara slipped into the side tunnel, her shotgun held tight. The mine exploded with a roar of gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off the rock walls, sending chips of stone flying like shrapnel. Silas, using his knowledge of the wild, was a ghost in the shadows, his shots precise and deadly, taking down Morrison's men one by one. Morrison, consumed by his rage, focused only on Silas. It was then that he made his confession, screaming it over the gunfire. "I told them where you were." He howled, his face a mask of anguish. "I paid a scout to tell the Cheyenne war chief where to find your homestead. I just wanted to scare her, Silas. To make her see you weren't safe, to make her come home. I never meant for them to kill her." The revelation stunned Silas into stillness. This entire vendetta, this lifetime of hatred, was built on Jake's own guilt. Just as Morrison turned his pistol on the momentarily frozen Silas, a blast from the shadows behind him sent his gun flying. Clara Ara stepped out of the tunnel, her face set, the smoking shotgun in her hands. Silas lunged, tackling Morrison to the ground. The two men, brothers-in-law, bound by love and hate for the same woman, fought with a savage desperation. It ended with Silas's bone-handled knife at Morrison's throat. "Do it," Jake rasped, tears of guilt and grief streaming down his face. "End it. It's what I deserve." Silas looked from the broken man beneath him to his daughter, who was staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. He saw the flash of a porcelain doll, the memory of a promise, and the face of the woman who had taught him that love was a choice. Revenge was an ending. Forgiveness, however painful, was a beginning. He lowered the knife. "No," Silas said, his voice ragged. "You don't get to die. You get to live with what you did. Every single day." He bound his brother-in-law, left him for the authorities, a fate he knew that was far worse than a quick death. In the aftermath, the world felt blessedly quiet. The storm outside had passed, and the first rays of morning sun were filtering into the mine. Silas cut Emma free, and she flew into his arms, burying her face in his chest. Clara joined them, her arms wrapping around them, both holding their fractured family together. They were bruised and exhausted, but they were whole. The meeting with Mrs. Donovan took place a week later in the office of a Denver lawyer. She was a different woman, her icy composure shattered by the realization of her own son's tragic role in Sarah's death. When she saw Emma clinging to Silas's hand, with Clara's protective arm around the girl's shoulder, she finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at Silas. Not with hatred, but with a shared profound grief. "I was wrong," she whispered, her voice choked. "I was so wrong. I was only trying to protect her." "I know," Silas said, his own voice gentle. "We all were." In that moment of shared sorrow, the war ended. Mrs. Donovan gave them her blessing, relinquishing custody of Emma, with a final tearful hug, recognizing that a family was not defined by picket fences, but by a fierce, unconditional love that had been tested in the darkest of minds and had emerged into the light. They found their meadow high in the mountains, a secret place of wildflowers and whispering aspens, far from the ghosts of Redemption and Denver. This was where they would build their home. One sun-drenched afternoon, Silas sat with Emma on a sun-warmed boulder. He took out his father's bone-handled knife. "This was my father's," he said, his voice soft, "and his father's before him. It's a tool for survival, for carving a life out of the wild. But it's also for building. I want you to have it." He placed the knife in her small hands. "Not to fight, Emma Bird, but to build your future." Emma looked at the knife, then up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She understood the weight of the gift. It was a legacy of strength, of survival, and now of peace. Clara watched them, her heart so full it felt it might burst. She took out her mother's worn prayer book. She found a perfect purple wildflower growing near the boulder, and carefully pressed it between the pages of Ruth, a symbol of their new life taking root between the stories of their pasts. As she closed the book, she felt a familiar, gentle flutter deep within her. It was a secret she had been holding for 2 weeks, a quiet, joyful certainty. Silas's promise, made in the depths of a fevered dream, had been fulfilled in a way more profound than either of them could have ever imagined. She was pregnant. A new life, a new beginning born from the ashes of old sorrows. This was home. This was family.